Onto this panel, we have three of the research fellows from the Making Science Public Programme presenting some initial thoughts on their respective projects. I just thought it might be helpful to introduce them and maybe introduce the project leaders that they're working with, actually, because although you'll know some of them, you may not know all of them. So Judith Tsouvalis is going to go first. She's working with Sujatha, who many of you will already know, that's less of an issue. But we also have Adam Spencer, who's working with Susan Seymour and Carol Morris from Geography. Where are they? They're over here. So those of you who don't know them but are interested in finding out more about the project, please feel free to speak to them too. And then Warren Pierce, who's working with Brigitte, and you all know Brigitte. Each presentation will take about 10 minutes, perhaps 12. I'm being promised 12, right? So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Judith, and thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So in this session, we will talk about issues linked to the topic of the politics of making science public. And in my sort of brief introductory talk, I want to look at a couple of theories that conceive of science as a depoliticizing force. Now, this move of conceptualizing science in this way, I want to argue, plays an important role in the making public of science. And it can be seen as a strategy of putting into question sort of taken for granted assumptions that still circulate in a lot of discourses, particularly between sort of the relations between science and policy making, as I want to show later on. Now, the sort of notion of science as a depoliticizing force is something that has become interesting to the project I'm working on with Dr. Sujatha Raman, and I'm afraid this diagram doesn't quite look as it did on my computer at home, so I don't know what happened to it in the process of putting it up here. But anyway, I just want to briefly say that what Dr. Raman and I are particularly interested in are the normative criteria that underpin the boundaries between politics, science and publics, and how they are drawn and institutionalized in theory and in practice. And this entails a sort of ongoing process of mapping how politics, science and publics are theorized and enacted in different contexts and settings. And I just put you up some of the sort of different ways in which publics have become conceptualized and politics and science in different sort of ways. For example, in the public deficit model, when we talk about science, progress and wealth, as Professor Feld has just done, the notion of trust and dialogue and engagement, they all presume different understandings of publics, of politics and of science, and they overlap and there are tensions between them. So here I want to just share with you a particular conceptualization of science in the academic literature, which I hope will bring up some questions and debate that links to our sort of panel discussion on the politics of making science public. And the first conceptualization of science as a depoliticizing force comes from the work of well-known French scholar of science and technology studies, Bruno Latour. Now, for Latour, science in the modern era, and this is quite significant, he talks about modernity and enlightenment, and has become a supposedly non-political representative for nature. So, in other words, science speaks on the behalf of nature, including cells, genes, viruses, bacteria, and other life forms and biophysical processes in politics, and it presents nature as fact. In politics or in policy making, we could say. So scientific facts as the knowledge and understanding of scientists have of nature is seen in this framework as officially valued above all other forms of knowledge. And it has historically been perceived as rational, neutral, objective, and universal. And we still find versions of this belief circulating in many of the debates we hear about science, publics, and politics. However, as science and technology scholars have long shown, the production of scientific fact is far from an objective and neutral process. It is enmeshed in economic, historical, social and political contexts in which science with a small s, as Ulrike Feld has defined it, takes place. And yet the belief of scientific knowledge as value-free and objective is still very prevalent today. And as I said, it often emerges, particularly in discourses between which kind of expertise to take on board in policy making and how to evaluate different forms of knowledge about an issue. Now, for Latour, he argues that we need new ways of dealing with the complexities that are thrown up to us with the kinds of problems we face. And we need frameworks where nature can be contested and where science can be contested. In other words, where nature is not taken as self-evident and knowledge and expertise can be debated, and where uncertainty is accepted as a sort of main condition in which humans find themselves rather than searching for certainty. And also he stresses the importance of the creation of the connections of people and things, and doubt and questioning extended to our own representations. In other words, we need to question the scientific apparatus as the representations like graphs or charts we produce about nature. Now, I don't have time here to go into his material politics, and they're very important in Latour's framework, because things are seen here as playing an active role in politics and in all our relations with the world, rather than human agencies being sort of seen as a superior force. But what I want to emphasize here is his emphasis on science as this sort of way of foreclosing politics. So he argues to get around this, that we need to shift our attention away from matters of fact to what he calls matters of concern. And for that we need to create what he calls new collectives. This is for him a sort of new arrangement between humans and the natural world that allow us to gather around things that concern us in a way that we can passionately differ and dispute. So here we have one account that sort of presents science as a way that doesn't really allow much space for politics or for people to ask questions that might be of concern to them, rather than being driven by sort of concerns for a technological or scientific fix of an issue. Now I want to present a second body of theory, which has sort of more come from political theory and philosophy, that uses the notion of post-politics. And post-politics, again, is sort of making a similar sort of argument to that of Latour, but of course in many different ways. These theories different, and to the body of that theory belongs the work of Jacques Rancière, Alain Badiou, Chantal Mouffe, and Slavoj Zizek. Now, Zizek is first used the notion of post-politics in 1999, and he defined it as the degeneration of the political. And he linked this degeneration to the demise of different global ideological visions of different parties and their replacement, what he defines as the collaboration of enlightened technocrats and liberal multiculturalists. Now, this is very much a sort of strand of thinking that comes from the political left. And again, I don't really have time to go into that much detail here, but it sort of encapsulates the idea that we are increasingly trying to solve social and cultural problems by focusing again on a sort of techno fix. And the post-political condition is, among other things, characterized by these thinkers as the disappearance of a democratic agonistic struggle where everyone can participate over the content and direction of socio-ecological life. There is the consensus-seeking component, that we try to find consensus in governing and in policy making, It is also linked to the widespread embrace of neoliberal ideologies and the practices and their effects on collective values and actions, and technical managerial and consensual administration. And you can probably see here that this does raise important questions as to the question of science, scientific expertise, and how we think about that. Now, a classical example of how this theory of post-politics has been used is Erik Swingerdahl's work on climate change, and he observes that climate governance and the policing of environmental concerns are among the key arenas through which this post-political consensus becomes constructed when politics proper is progressively replaced by expert social administration. And Warren will probably talk about this a little bit later on. Now, last week I went to a STEP seminar at the University of Sussex, and I know some of you were there as well. And I just made a few notes of things I picked up over these 2 days, which I think sort of nicely highlight this particular set of arguments which I've just described. So, someone pointed out that political institutions are willing to accept a situation where one fact or number is sought to justify politics. A former chief scientific advisor says we need to find mechanisms to bring non-scientific forms of knowledge into the system, while another one felt that the scientific advisory system in Europe is broken. There are too many vested interests of governance. Now, concerning the influence on government decision-making, we have a complete blind spot on politics and power. And someone else pointed out that the status of scientific advice depends on what science and technology mean to the economy of a country. And this is really very significant in terms of what Professor Feld has just described, this sort of dominance of the idea that science and technology will, sort of kickstart the economy again, that they're sort of the solution to all our problems. Now, I'm reviewing these strands of argument here because they give us one perspective on how we might interpret the politics of making science public. And the way I look at this in this particular context is that it sort of opens up the idea of science and the use of scientific evidence in policy making to publics, and invites other pertinent questions as well. For example, I'm quite intrigued in a way about how much we talk about transparency and openness in science, but that much less emphasis is placed on openness and transparency of political processes. And again, someone made quite a nice comment at the STEP seminar and wondered, why do we have ethics committees for science and technology and not for business and politics? But we can hopefully talk about that in the discussion. Now, I should just say, in case all these theories sound quite abstract, I was actually involved in a 3-year project with Lancaster University where we experimented with Latour's ideas of new collectives in practice. And if you want to ask any questions about that, we can do so perhaps in the break or after the seminar. But it was really interesting because we made the theory very explicit, and we worked with farmers, with policymakers, with local residents, and it was quite interesting for me to see how different this process of engagement was to other forms of engagement I've previously been involved with. So I leave it there. Was that 12 minutes?
Yes, it was.
All right.